Welcome to our Friday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. This week I've started a series talking about Joseph and taking lessons from the life of Joseph. On Monday's broadcast I used 1 Corinthians chapter 10 to show that all of these things that were written about people in the Old Testament were for our example so that we could learn through them. And I'm telling you, the life of Joseph has just been a major influence in my life. There's a lot of things that parallel this. And so what I did for the first 4 days of this week is to show that God gave Joseph these two dreams. That was the word of the Lord. That's how God revealed Himself to Joseph and showed Joseph that he had a supernatural plan for his life. And for the next 13 years, after Joseph received this revelation, everything in his life looked contrary to what God had revealed to him in these dreams. And I've brought out the point that you have to start with a dream. God is going to show you the positive things that He wants to do in your life, because in between when He reveals that will to you and when you see it come to pass, there's going to be a lot of negative things happen. Not necessarily from the Lord, but just in life. There's a lot of negative things that happen. And it takes time for God to prepare us and to get us to a place to where we're usable. And during that period of time, this vision that God puts in your heart keeps you going. Proverbs chapter 29 says, where there is no vision, the people perish. You have to have a vision. You have to have a goal for your life. Most people are shooting at nothing and hitting it every time. It's better to have a goal out there and shoot at the stars, and if you miss, you land on the moon. That's still more than most people do. You got to have a vision. You got to be going somewhere. You know, I just drove about over 5,500 miles in the last month. And to get to those places that I was going to, I had to look up and determine and get the road numbers and make plans. I couldn't just start driving and hope that I wind up at a certain place. I guarantee you, if you want to drive from New York to California, you are going to have to look at a map, or you're going to have to use a GPS, or you're going to have to do something. If you just start driving, you aren't going to automatically wind up there. You got to have a goal in mind. You got to pursue it. You got to make the right turns along the way. Your life is a product of your decisions that you make, and you got to make the right decisions. So we've already talked about all of that, and that was in Genesis chapter 37. Now we come to Genesis chapter 39, and this is where Joseph had been sold into slavery. And in Genesis chapter 39, and in verse 1, it says, And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmeelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. You know, that verse 2 is one of the most important verses that God has ever spoken to me. I think some people just pass over this and don't think about it, but look at the circumstances. Joseph had been raised in the house of Jacob, or Israel, a super wealthy man. You could go back and spend a lot of time showing that how that Abraham passed all of his blessing down to Isaac. Isaac passed it down to Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, many daughters. I mean, multitude of slaves, servants. He was very prosperous. He was very wealthy. And out of all of his children, Joseph was the favorite one. He had a coat of many colors. He was preferred above his brethren. He had been raised in the lap of luxury. He was very prosperous, very wealthy, and then his brothers sold him into slavery. So just in a matter of days, I mean, I don't know the exact timing, but let's just say 1 week. 1 week before this, he was wearing this coat of many colors, the favorite son of his father, the favorite of all of the brethren. He stood to inherit more than anybody else. He was stinking, filthy, rich. Everything about him was good. And now here he is standing on an auction block, and the way that they sold slaves was they would take their clothes off and put these rags down beside them so that the buyer could see what he was buying. He wanted to see his good, whether he was healthy or not. So here's Joseph standing there stripped naked on an auction block, being sold as a slave. Here's Potiphar, this wealthy man. I'm sure he was wearing the fanciest robes. He probably had jewelry. He probably had an entourage around him. Did you know in the natural, people would look at those two, Potiphar wearing all of the fancy clothes, Joseph standing there stripped naked. His brothers had stripped him of his coat of many colors, so all he had was his undergarments in the first place, and he had even been stripped of those. Here's a person being sold as a slave, stripped naked. Here's a man wearing all of the jewels and the finery, and God looks at him and says, man, Joseph is a very prosperous man. I tell you what, that is powerful. God doesn't see things the way that we see things. And this is one of the reasons that we get into so much discouragement and so much despair, and we have unbelief and all of these problems, is because we don't think the way that God thinks. God doesn't evaluate you being a prosperous man or a woman based on the size of your house, your car, your clothes, your jewelry, the kind of car that you drive, and all of these things that the world evaluates prosperity by. That's not how God sees things. Here's God looking at a man who he had lost his family. He had been lied about by his brothers. His father thought he was dead, had written him off as dead. And here's this man stripped naked, being sold as a slave, and God says, that's a prosperous man. I tell you what, that has ministered to me so much. You know, I mentioned this earlier in the week, but I was raised in a very affluent situation. We weren't super wealthy. I mean, I don't guess people would have called us rich, but we were blessed. And I had all of this. When Jamie and I got married, I had $5,000 in the bank. I had a new car and all of these things. And man, I was dumber than a hammer. And I had been called to the ministry, and I thought that to be called to the ministry and to live by faith, I had to get rid of all of these assets. And so the very first thing I did when Jamie and I got married, I went to the bank, I withdrew all of this cash, I put it into $100 bills, and I just gave it to people. I stood at 7-Eleven stores, and as people came out, I'd hand somebody $100 bills. I gave away $5,000 in one day, just couldn't wait to get out there and be living by faith. How dumb can you get and still breathe? And you know what? For 13 years, Jamie and I nearly starved to death. I mean, we just struggled. And it wasn't God's fault. It was my fault. I was wrong. My heart was right, but my head was wrong. I just was going to trust God. But because you're trusting God doesn't mean that you take all of the blessings and the assets that God had given us and give them away. But anyway, nonetheless, you know what? I went through periods of time. Jamie was 8 months pregnant with our first child, and we went 2 weeks without any food. Not voluntarily, but because we didn't have any food. I mean, some people, when they say that they're going hungry, you know, you'll hear people talk about that there's so many millions of children that go to bed hungry every night, and many of those, it's just that they aren't getting all of that they want, but they're eating. When I say that Jamie and I went without food, we went without food. We didn't have anything but water to drink for 2 weeks with her 8 months pregnant. And that was my fault. It wasn't God that did that to us. That was my own stupidity. Praise God for my wife that never one time criticized me. Boy, she had justification. She could have left me. She could have done all kinds of things. And yet she never one time criticized me. I was wrong, but I didn't realize it at the time. Anyway, my point is that during this time of poverty that was self-induced because of my own stupidity and my own mistakes, during this period of time, I never saw myself poor. I never saw myself poor. We never went to anybody and begged and asked for help. There was times, you know, actually, after all of this, after we got through it and after we began to prosper, I remember Jamie's parents found out some of the hardships that we went through, and Jamie's dad got really mad at me and said, you should have asked. You should have let somebody know. They never had a clue that we were struggling financially because we never acted like it. We never talked like it. We never dropped hints. I'm telling you, there's a lot of people that struggle financially, but they see themselves poor. During that time, I never saw myself poor. I saw myself prosperous. And I really believe that this is what was going on with Joseph. Joseph had these dreams from God. And he knew that someday he was going to be exalted in a place where his brothers would come and bow down to him. Even his father would come and bow down to him. And what he was seeing and experiencing at this time, standing there stripped naked, being auctioned off as a slave, that was contrary to everything he was believing for. And yet he had a word from God. And Joseph held on to that. I know some people think I may be reading things into this and that, oh no, Joseph went through a Great Depression and all this. But the story that's recorded right here in Genesis chapter 39 is inconsistent with that. As you go on and read through this, the favor of God was on Joseph. And it was so obvious that other people saw it. In the very next verse, it says, "And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand." Let me just say to you that that kind of prosperity and blessing does not manifest itself in a person who's depressed, who's defeated, who's sitting there sucking his thumb, talking about how bad everything is going. You know, I deal with a lot of people. And I've had people come to me in desperate, dire situations. And often those people are just sitting here griping and complaining and saying it's not fair, and they're depressed and they're negative, and they see the worst side of everything. And I'm telling you, people with that attitude don't come out of their problems. For Joseph to prosper, for him to be exalted and promoted to be the head of Potiphar's house and given so much power that Potiphar didn't even know what assets he had. He didn't pay attention to anything. He had 100% total trust and confidence in Joseph. That doesn't happen when people are sitting there griping and complaining and licking their wounds and talking about how unfair it is and doing all of these kind of things. The way that Joseph prospered, the way that God flowed through him, says volumes. It doesn't tell us exactly what Joseph was thinking, but his actions speak volumes. And this is one of the things that I've learned through Joseph. You know, when the Lord called me, when He changed my life, March the 23rd, 1968, the very first really positive thing that I saw happen was around 1980. It was 12 years later, and that was just the beginning. I mean, probably, I could say it was 15 years or more before other people looking at me in my situation could have thought, well, you know what, maybe some of these things you're saying about God and what He's called you to do, maybe they are coming to pass. But it took a long period of time. And during that period of time, I can tell you that I sat there and I saw myself prosperous when I didn't have 2 pennies to rub together. When we were being evicted from houses, when we were going through hardship because we couldn't pay. Did you know what? I still saw myself prosperous. I stood against the depression and the unbelief. And it was because, just like Joseph, God had planted a dream in my heart. And I didn't know how what I was going through at that moment could be reconciled with that dream, but just somehow I was able to look beyond the physical circumstances I was in, and that hope and that dream that God had placed in my heart enabled me to stay consistent through that period of time. I believe that's exactly what was going on with Joseph. Matter of fact, I use this story about Joseph to see and encourage myself when everything around me was looking negative. You know, I had this dream of reaching millions of people. And the very first thing I felt got led by God to do was to quit school, which immediately got me drafted and sent to Vietnam. And I sat in Vietnam and it looked like I was going to die. Then when I got out of Vietnam, I was led to leave the denomination that I was in, and I started this little tiny church in Seagoville, Texas. And the largest crowd we had outside of times that I gave food away and since bribed people to come in, the largest crowd we had was 12. And usually there was only 5 of us. My wife and me, my firstborn son who was less than a year old, and I had an assistant pastor and his wife. That's weird to have an assistant pastor when you only have 5 or 6 people in the church. And then we would have another 5 or 7 people that would come, and that was it. And we labored like that for 2 years. We had no income, and everything in the natural looked like, man, it's not going to work. And yet I just kept believing somehow because I had these words from God. Then we moved from there to Childress, Texas. And in Childress, Texas, I was renting a house. And during the time that I was renting this house, it had a large room on it that would seat 100 people, and that's where we held our church services. And we had about 50, maybe 60 would have been the maximum we ever held. And I really had to have that house. We didn't have enough money to go rent a building, so I was just meeting in our house, and yet I didn't have enough money to pay our rent. And I remember going to my landlord. He owned a photography business in Childress, Texas, and I went to him the very day that the rent was due. Here's something I would really suggest to some of you that may be having financial hardships, and that is, don't avoid the people. If you don't have money for your rent, if you don't have money for a bill, go directly to them and let them know that you may be struggling, you're having problems, but you are going to get this paid. You are going to do it. And if people, not every person, but the majority of people, if you owe money to a landlord, if you go to them and are upfront, they'll give you some mercy, they'll give you some grace. But it's when you avoid them and you just allow their imagination to run wild, they think that you're taking advantage of them. You can stop that problem by just going directly to them. So the very day that I owed this money to my landlord, I went to him and I said, I'm sorry, I do not have this money, but I guarantee you I am going to get it paid. And so this man, he owned a photography studio, and he had a package deal with the high school. He had shot all of their photographs, and he was supposed to be producing this package deal, and the guy that developed pictures for him had quit. The boss was having to do it and run the business, take in, people that were wanting them and their children pictures and things, and he just couldn't do it all. He had fallen behind, and he was about to lose all of the money for this high school, their pictures. And so he says, I'll let you work it off. He says, you owe me money. He says, I'll just let you work for me, and I'll pay you by paying your rent. And so anyway, I was in a position where I couldn't turn him down because I owed him the money. So I went in. It's a long story, but the reason I'm bringing this up is to say I was in a financial bind. I was struggling financially, but I never saw myself poor. And I knew that the blessing and the favor of God was on me. And so when I went into this man's business, I started blessing his business. I started speaking over it. And I hadn't got time to tell you everything that happened, but I mean in 2 months' time, I got all of those pictures done for the entire high school. I saved this man's business. I brought him out of bankruptcy. And I turned out to be better at developing these pictures than he was. And he had done that for over 20-something years. I mean, I did one thing, I'm not going to go into it, but I did something. He came and he says, you couldn't do this again if you tried. He says, I've been doing this for 26 years and only maybe once or twice in my life have I ever done something like this. And I took him into a back room and showed him about 100 of those things. And he just threw his hands up and he said, I don't know what you're doing, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it. And the blessing and the favor of God was on me. And did you know, in 2 months' time, that man offered me 50% of his business, an equal partnership if I would come in and work with him. And I had to turn him down because, no, I was called to the ministry. But I'm saying that I had the favor of God on me, and other people saw it. And it didn't happen accidentally. It happened because I was believing for it. I had promises from God. God told me that whatever I set my hand unto would prosper. And when I came into that business, I started believing. I prayed. I spoke blessings over that business. And that's the reason that within 2 months I was offered 50% of that. I don't know what that was worth, but it was at least a $50,000 business. It might have been worth $100,000. But he offered me, in a sense, $25,000 or $50,000 partnership in this thing because of the favor of God that was on my life. And it didn't happen without my cooperation. I'm not saying it was me doing it. It was God's blessing, but I believed for it. And that's exactly what happened with Joseph right here. Joseph was in a negative situation where the vast majority of the people watching this program, if you had been the favored son and wealthy and all of these things and then sold into slavery, the vast majority of people would have been pouting, would have been mad, angry at God, griping, complaining, moaning, sitting there sucking your thumb. You certainly wouldn't have been diligent and giving it everything you had. But Joseph, see, he still had faith in God. He was a prosperous man even when he was sold as a slave. You know, compared to what you and I are going through, it's nothing compared to what Joseph went through. Some of you may be going through hardships right now. Maybe things aren't working out financially. Maybe your marriage is struggling. Maybe your job is at jeopardy. Maybe your health, you're struggling in your health. But man, it's nothing compared to what Joseph went through. And yet Joseph was able to believe that he was a prosperous man, even when he had nothing in the natural to show for it. If Joseph did it, you can do it. Remember those verses over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 6 and 11. It says, these things were written for our instruction, for our admonition, so that we could learn through them. If Joseph could still believe God, even when he was sold into slavery, if he could believe that he still was going to prosper and someday he would be in an exalted position to where his brothers and his father would come and bow down to him. If he could believe it, and he didn't have the baptism of the Holy Spirit, the Word of God, these examples, all of the things that we've got today, if he could do it with less, certainly we could still believe with more, with all of the benefits and all of the things that we have. Joseph didn't have access to somebody on television trying to encourage him and to say that these visions and dreams are still going to come to pass. He was totally isolated and by himself. And yet, here some of us are, and we're just complaining. I'm telling you, you need to just grab hold of yourself. You need to stir yourself up. You need to encourage yourself in the Lord your God. 1 Samuel chapter 30, I believe it is where David was just moments away from being stoned to death by his own man. He had lost his wife, his children, his city was burned, and it says that he encouraged himself in the Lord his God. If David could encourage himself in a situation like that, if Joseph could encourage himself when he was sold into slavery and everything in the natural looked completely contrary to what God had told him, if they could encourage themselves, you can encourage yourself. I can encourage myself. Man, I pray that you're getting this. Instead of this condemning you, this inspires me. This inspires me that, man, if Joseph did this, I can do this. I can still believe that I'm blessed of God even when things in the natural don't look like I'm blessed of God. I tell you, this is a key. This is a key to seeing God's will fulfilled in your life. You have to keep yourself encouraged in the Lord. You can't depend on other people to do it. Encourage yourself today. Take these scriptures and encourage yourself.